All right, so we're going to dive deep today into a case, well, it really flips the script on the usual true crime mysteries. We're talking about a murder, and get this, the why, the motive remains a total mystery, and that's exactly what we're tackling today. We're using murder with no motive, a crime that makes no sense to guide us.
You know, what really gets me about this one is that it happened in a seemingly perfect town, the kind of place you see in movies, right? Neighbors leave their doors unlocked, everyone knows each other, and yet, boom, this brutal crime, totally inexplicable, just shakes the whole community.
It feels like something out of a thriller novel, but this is real life. Our source tells us about the victim, insert name from source, and by all accounts, they were just an ordinary person living an ordinary life.
Right, but the way they died, that was anything but ordinary. The details are, well, chilling, to say the least. It points to intense rage, like this wasn't just some random act. It was deliberate, methodical, almost.
Which makes the lack of a motive even weirder, right? No robbery, no enemies that anyone knew of, no connection to any criminal activity. So what in the world could have triggered such a violent outburst?
That's what stumped investigators right from the start. They went in looking for the usual suspects, right? A jealous ex, someone with a grudge, maybe a financial motive, but every lead just hit a wall.
Like chasing a ghost, huh?
Mhm.
The source mentioned some grainy CCTV footage of someone near the crime scene, but it wasn't clear enough to be helpful. And then there were those vague eyewitness accounts, people seeing someone who just seemed out of place, but nothing concrete.
And even the forensics, fingerprints, DNA, nothing matched. It must have been so frustrating. Usually the motive is like a compass. You follow it and it points you in the right direction. But here, they were in the dark, totally.
Demoralizing, right? So how do you even change your approach when you're working with basically nothing?
Well, you got to think outside the box. Consider things that seem far-fetched, maybe. That's where profiling comes in.
So instead of who, they had to focus on why, even without any real evidence to guide them.
Exactly. Profiling, in these kinds of cases, it's less about finding a specific person and more about figuring out the psychology, the behavior patterns that could have led to this. For example, some profilers, they specialize in analyzing crime scenes to understand the killer's state of mind. Were they planning this? What was their relationship to the victim? That sort of thing.
Okay, so try and piece together a psychological puzzle, basically.
Yeah, precisely. And as investigators started piecing together what little they had, some pretty unsettling theories started to emerge. One that caught my eye was the possibility of a psychopathic offender.
I remember the source mentioned that too. But wouldn't a psychopath, well, would the crime scene be more chaotic, not so focused and full of rage?
See, that's a common misconception. We see psychopaths in movies, and they're always impulsive and disorganized, but it's not always like that. Some are incredibly meticulous, especially if it helps them achieve their goal. And when there's no obvious motive, it makes their actions even more confusing.
So the rage, the focused rage,
Yeah.
doesn't rule out psychopathy.
Not at all. Actually, it could even be a sign of a specific type of psychopath, the kind who gets satisfaction from the act itself, from having that power over their victim in such a calculated way.
Chilling. The source also brought up another theory,
Yeah.
and it's equally unsettling. A hidden motive. Something so deeply buried that it's invisible to everyone except the killer themselves.
The invisible motive, yeah. This one really gets into the how complex and contradictory human psychology can be. You familiar with the idea of cognitive dissonance?
Remind me.
Well, cognitive dissonance is that feeling of discomfort we get when our beliefs clash or when we do something that doesn't align with our values. So imagine someone who does something horrific, but they can't even admit to themselves why they did it.
So their mind, it creates a blind spot to protect itself.
Exactly. They might come up with a justification, even if it makes no sense, just so they can live with themselves. That could explain why some killers give these bizarre explanations for their crimes.
Adds a whole new layer of complexity to this, wow. So we've got two possibilities, both disturbing. A psychopath who gets off on the act itself, or someone with a motive so hidden we might never find it. And it seemed like the investigators were stuck, like in a maze with no way out.
It was. The source describes those early stages as a puzzle with missing pieces. But then, just when things seemed hopeless, a tiny clue appeared. A small glimmer of light in all that darkness.
The classic break in the case. What was it? A fingerprint, a witness they missed, a connection to another crime.
Well, the source is vague, but it seems like it wasn't some huge revelation, not like a DNA match or confession. It was something small, easily overlooked, something that seemed unimportant at first.
Hiding in plain sight. Like in those detective shows where they find a tiny fiber or something and it cracks the case wide open.
You got it. A classic example of how even the smallest detail can be crucial, especially in a case like this. And this little clue, it's what finally led them to a suspect.
A face to this faceless terror.
Yeah.
Finally. Did they have a record? Were they someone the police had already looked at?
That's where the source keeps us in suspense. It doesn't tell us who the suspect is, but it gives us two possibilities, both intriguing and both, well, disturbing.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me. What were the two scenarios?
So the first one, the suspect, was someone who fit the ordinary person who snapped profile. No history of violence, no warning signs, just blended right into that quiet town.
Like that saying, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, right? Except here, it's more like the devil you don't know could be living right next door. Scary thought.
It plays on our fear of the unknown, for sure. Makes you wonder, is anyone truly immune to the things that can push someone over the edge?
Right. What could make someone snap like that? A sudden break, built-up resentment that boils over, or something else entirely that we can't even imagine?
And that brings us to the second possibility, maybe even more chilling than the first. What if the suspect, the one they caught because of that tiny clue, what if they were the killer with the hidden motive? What if they confessed, but gave no reason, no justification, no remorse, nothing?
A confession with no motive.
Yeah.
Talk about a mind game. I mean, trying to understand the why when you have no leads is one thing, but when the killer themselves won't tell you, that's just unsettling.
Like staring into a void, right? A black hole of human motivation. It challenges everything, how we investigate, even how we understand human nature. It makes you wonder, are there some acts, some parts of the human mind that we'll just never understand?
So we're left with these two possibilities, and neither one is easy to swallow. An ordinary person driven to do something unthinkable, or a killer who takes their motive to the grave, leaving behind a ton of unanswered questions and a community trying to cope with something that makes no sense.
And as we keep going, we're going to see how this crime affected the town, the investigators, maybe even how we see the world ourselves.
I'm definitely on the edge of my seat. We'll be right back to uncover the final chapter of this haunting case.
So, where were we? Oh, yeah, those two possibilities we were talking about. The ordinary person who snapped, or the killer with a motive so hidden we may never even know what it was.
Yeah, either one has the potential to really, I don't know, just shake our sense of security. Like if it turns out this killer was just an average Joe who, for whatever reason, just crossed this unimaginable line, well, it makes you wonder, right? Could anyone do something like that?
It definitely makes you question those assumptions we make about, well, about who we think is dangerous, who's capable of violence. We like to put people in boxes, good or bad, but real life is way more complicated. Human behavior, there's a whole spectrum there. And sometimes the line between those boxes, it gets blurry, especially in extreme situations.
So that idea, it can happen to anyone. It's not just like paranoia. There's some real psychology behind it.
Oh, absolutely. There's this fascinating study by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist. His obedience to authority experiments, they showed how ordinary people can actually hurt others if they're put in a situation where they feel pressure to obey.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those, the ones where people had to give electric shocks to someone else. Pretty messed up.
That's the one. Now, obviously, those were in a controlled setting, but they give you a glimpse into how powerful the situation can be in influencing how we act. And in this case, it makes you wonder, what kind of pressure, what internal struggle could push someone that far?
It's weird, right? Like the lack of a motive makes it scarier somehow.
Yeah.
If there's no reason, it feels like it could happen anywhere, to anyone.
That randomness, yeah, that's what makes motiveless crime so unsettling. It shatters the illusion of order, that things make sense, that things are predictable. And that brings us back to that second possibility, the killer with the hidden motive.
Right, the one whose reason for doing this is buried so deep, even they might not fully get it, like trying to crack a code without the key.
Imagine someone with repressed memories, trauma they haven't dealt with, maybe even a mental condition that distorts their view of reality. Their actions might seem totally illogical to us, but in their own twisted way, it makes sense to them.
So they might not even be aware of the real reason they did it.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complicated, for the investigation and for justice. How do you hold someone accountable when maybe they don't even understand why they did it?
A whole bunch of legal and ethical questions there, wow. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's get back to that break in the case. What was the clue that finally gave investigators a lead?
Well, the source doesn't give specifics, but it seems like it wasn't some big dramatic thing, not a DNA match out of nowhere or anything, more like something subtle, something they missed before, or maybe thought was unimportant at the time.
So something they had all along but didn't realize it. Kind of like those detective shows where they find some tiny thing, a fiber or something, and that's what solves the whole thing.
Exactly. Shows how even the smallest detail matters, especially in a complicated case like this. And that little clue, that's what pointed them to a suspect.
Finally, they had someone. Did this person have a criminal history? Were they someone the police already knew about?
And here's where the source leaves us hanging again. Doesn't tell us who the suspect is, but gives us two possibilities, both, well, kind of disturbing.
All right, lay it on me. What were the two scenarios?
Well, in the first one, the suspect fit that ordinary person who snapped profile. No history of violence, no red flags, just blended in with everyone else in that quiet town.
The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Only here, it's more like the devil you don't know could be your next-door neighbor. Creepy.
Gets right to that primal fear, fear of the unknown, that darkness hiding under the surface of everyday life. Makes you wonder, are any of us really immune to those pressures, those triggers that can make someone snap?
Makes you think, what could make a seemingly normal person do something so brutal? A mental break. Some long-held grudge that finally explodes. Or something totally different, something we can't even fathom.
And that leads us to the second possibility, maybe even more chilling than the first. What if the suspect, the one they caught, because of that one little clue, what if they fit the hidden motive profile? What if they confessed but didn't say why? No explanation, no remorse, nothing.
A confession with no motive.
Yeah.
That's got to be frustrating for the investigators, right? I mean, trying to figure out the why when you have nothing to go on is hard enough, but when the killer themselves won't tell you, that's a whole other level.
It really is. It's like they have this answer, the one piece of the puzzle everyone's looking for, but they just keep it to themselves. It's like they want to hold on to that power even after they're caught.
So we've got these two possibilities, and neither one is very comforting. An ordinary person driven to do something horrific, or a killer who keeps their motive a secret, leaving everyone else to wonder why.
And in the next part, we'll look at how this crime affected the town, the investigators, and maybe even how we see the world ourselves.
Okay, so we've been talking about this murder case, the one where the motive, the why, is still a huge mystery.
Mhm.
And it really makes you think about some pretty dark stuff about people, about how fragile our sense of safety really is.
It goes beyond the usual true crime story. This isn't just about who did it or how they did it. It's about that why, that question that haunts everyone, the investigators, the people who lived through it.
Earlier, you mentioned how this crime really affected the town. Can you talk more about that? Like, how do people even begin to cope when something like this happens in their own backyard?
Imagine you live in this place where you feel safe, right? You know your neighbors, life's pretty predictable, everything's familiar. Then all of a sudden, that sense of security, it's just shattered by this violent act that makes no sense. That's got to be traumatic for everyone.
The source mentioned how people started acting differently. More cautious, suspicious of everyone, even people they thought they knew. It's like the town lost its innocence or something.
That happens a lot in these situations. Sociologists and psychologists have studied it. They call it the shadow of crime. Basically, it's this lingering fear, this anxiety that hangs over a community long after the immediate danger is gone.
So it's not just about physical safety, but the mental and emotional impact too.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. Parents become way more protective of their kids. Neighbors who used to be friendly, they stay inside more. That trust that held the community together, it starts to unravel.
It's like a wound that never heals, a constant reminder of the darkness that's out there. And when there's no motive, no explanation, it's got to be even worse.
Right, because without that closure, that understanding of why, the fear just becomes this shapeless thing. It's everywhere. It gets into your head, Even the most rational people start thinking, what if?
Like a virus, spreading doubt and suspicion. And it shows you the power of the unknown, right? The things that scare us the most are the things we don't understand.
And that brings us right back to the core of this whole discussion. Our source material, it doesn't give us a nice, tidy ending, a clear explanation for why this happened, and maybe that's the scariest part of all.
So we're just left with these disturbing possibilities and unanswered questions. Is that it?
Not necessarily. We may never truly understand what drove this person to do what they did, but we can still learn from this, right? By exploring the complexities of human behavior, by understanding how easily our sense of safety can be shattered, and by seeing how deeply motiveless violence can affect people and whole communities.
It's a reminder that the world can be a pretty unpredictable place.
Hmm.
And sometimes the most important questions are the ones without easy answers.
And maybe by acknowledging that, by admitting there are things we just don't know, we can become more empathetic, more compassionate. Not to excuse what the killer did, but to remember that we're all human, even when faced with the darkest parts of ourselves.
That's a really powerful thought. I like that. It's about accepting the mystery, the ambiguity, and finding a way to move on, even when we're left with more questions than answers.
And maybe in those unanswered questions, there's room for reflection, for growth, for understanding ourselves and the world a little better.
So we started this deep dive wanting to untangle this murder case, this murder, without a motive. We might not have found all the answers, but we definitely uncovered some interesting things about human nature, about evil, about the power of the unknown.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. One that challenged what we thought we knew, made us curious, and left us thinking about the implications of this crime that just doesn't make sense.
And as we wrap up this look into the dark side of human behavior, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you could ask the killer one question, knowing you might not get a real answer, what would it be? What would you hope to learn from that why that hangs over this whole case? Keep that question in mind as we all try to navigate a world where sometimes the only thing we can be sure of is uncertainty itself.